We're really lucky today to have two of the best people to speak on this topic of critical reflections, South Africa 20 years on. Dan, at my immediate left, Dan O'Mara, teaches at the University of Quebec in Montreal, has written extensively about South Africa, Votes Capitalism, his award-winning 40 Lost Years, which I use in my classes to teach, and other work on South Africa. He's moved on to look at international relations theory, but for our session today, he's giving us the sort of rare opportunity to hear his thoughts. And I want to see the title, so can you scroll down a bit so I get it right? A Road Not Taken, Dismantling the Political Economy of Apartheid. And then to my far left, Hein Murray comes to us from Geneva. Both are from South Africa originally. Hein has written 2 editions of Limits to Change and then Push to the Limit, which has been described by a number of us as the best book if you want to understand the post-apartheid period that you can possibly get your hands on. So without wasting any more of your time, I'm turning it over to Dan, who will talk for 25 minutes, and then Hein, and then we'll have questions. Over to you, Dan.
Well, thank you very much, Linda, and good morning, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar and aging faces, some of whom I haven't seen for a long time. I was delighted to hear that I'm not on Linda's far left. I want to begin this talk with a disclaimer. I did not want to come here, not because I don't feel that the theme is important, but because I very deliberately decided in 2003 to stop working on South Africa. And I have not followed closely what has been going on in South Africa in any sense other than that of a concerned South African citizen. I have no research expertise on the period since 2003, and I have an absolute horror of academics who spout off in generalities about things that they don't study in detail. So I'm not going to talk in great length about South Africa today. What I want rather to do is to look at how South Africa's past, and particularly some of what I call the dynamics of its post-Second World War history, help us understand what is going on today. And more particularly, I'm going to try and look very briefly and schematically in 25 minutes at 3 things. How the evolving structural dynamics of South African society after the Second World War, together with the response of the ANC to these dynamics, together with a particular role played by the South African Communist Party in the overall strategy and politics of the ANC, enable us to at least have some kind of take on what has gone wrong since 1994. Because I start with the belief that although a great deal has been accomplished, South Africa has gone off the rails in a very disturbing way. So just let me say very briefly why the South African Communist Party, because it has been my conviction both as an analyst and as a militant that the South African Communist Party has always played the role, if you will forgive the analogy, of the Afrikaner Broederbond to the African National Congress's national party. It has been the strategic think tank of the ANC, the body which is set out very deliberately to recruit promising and up-and-coming young cadres and to place them in positions of influence so as to be able to have an overweening say in what goes on in the country. So we'll look at that. I also need to make two other preliminary remarks, although I'm going to be talking about, quote, the structural dynamics of South African history, and these might set off all sorts of warning signals for those who are no longer involved in Marxist analysis of South Africa. I don't believe that there are, quote, objective material forces at work. These are structural dynamics, are things that human beings believe are structural dynamics, that they create themselves, and that they remain structural dynamics only so long as human beings believe in them. And the second point, and this is a more possibly controversial point, is that a lot of what I read in passing of the literature on South Africa these days seems to me to be trapped in the past, in the sense that there is an attempt to recycle old concepts from an epoch that has disappeared and whose own logic and contradictions are no longer valid, and recycle these in slightly updated form, and I think that this is profoundly misleading. I think that South Africa and the world is in a very new and as yet unknown era of human history, that globalization has profoundly changed a number of things about the ways in which societies and the world work, and that we have not yet adapted our analytical methods to deal with these. And I am as guilty of this as anybody else. So that being said, I want to start my analysis with a reading of a bit of a blast from the past. I want to read to you two paragraphs, excuse me, from a document known as the Strategy and Tactics of the South African Revolution, which from 1969 until, if I'm not mistaken, 1999 remained the basic programmatic formulation of the ANC. These two paragraphs are the reason why I joined the ANC after much reflection in 1976. They're also the reason why I left it after much reflection in 1996. So let me quote. "It is inconceivable for liberation to have any meaning without the return of the wealth and the land of South Africa to the people as a whole. It is therefore a fundamental feature of our strategy that victory must embrace more than formal political democracy. To allow existing economic forces to retain their interests intact is to feed the root of racial supremacy and does not represent the shadow of liberation. Our drive towards national emancipation is therefore in a very real way bound up with economic emancipation. We have suffered more than just national humiliation. Our people are deprived of their due in the country's wealth. Their skills have been suppressed, and poverty and starvation has been their life experience. The correction of these centuries-old economic injustices lies at the very core of our national aspirations. We do not underestimate the complexities which will face the people's government during the transformation period, nor the enormity of the problems of meeting the economic needs of the mass of the oppressed people. But one thing is certain. In our land, this cannot be effectively tackled unless the basic wealth and basic resources are at the disposal of the people as a whole and are not manipulated by sections or individuals, be they white or black." Clearly, if this was the program and the analysis of the ANC, very little of this has been achieved. It seems to me that this remains a reasonably accurate description of current-day South Africa. So the kind of economic emancipation on which the Strategy and Tactics insisted has not really happened. What has happened is that the ranks of privileged have been opened up. Yes, there have been greater access to education, health and water and all of that. And these are vitally important, and I'm not denigrating them. And yes, the replacement of a totalitarian police state by a functioning political democracy is a vastly important step, and nobody is suggesting for a minute that the current South African government, and here we can say in a word the tragedy of South Africa today, the current South African government, and by that I mean the government since 1994, is the best South Africa has ever had. And I think that's enough just to give you an extent to the problem. So why has this not happened? Why has the insistence of the ANC in 1969 on economic liberation, why has it not occurred? There have been a number of explanations offered for this. I want to run through them very briefly. The most common, the one insisted upon by leading members of the ANC themselves, almost all ranks of business, the World Bank, etc., is the infamous TINA. There is no alternative. Not that anybody ever asked if there was an alternative. This has been declaimed as gospel truth, much like Stalin used to declaim gospel truth, and woe betide anybody who contested it. The second is the notion of betrayal. That various individuals or the organization of the ANC as a whole have become corrupt and bought off. Essentially that the Anglo-American corporation has done to the ANC what it did to the National Party in the 1960s. if this thesis is correct, it should be noted in passing that the rank and file of the National Party put up a far greater struggle against this tendency than has been done by the membership of the ANC. The third variant is the sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of those who have long harbored a Trotskyist analysis of South Africa. They insist that the ANC has always been a petty bourgeois nationalist movement, and that this was always doomed to happen, and it's the kind of we told you so, blah, 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 we were right, you were wrong. You know, we can name names. Some of the people around the room are grinning and they know to whom I am referring. The fourth explanation is the thesis of bad apples. The principal bad apple being Thabo Mbeki, who gave us the secondary bad apple of his longtime collaborator, Jacob Zuma, and that because of these bad apples, they have, the whole ANC has been corrupted. We also find, and I forget where I am, I think I'm number 5 now, is that there has been a vast conspiracy on the part of global capital, the IMF, etc., particularly in the shape and form of my former PhD supervisor, Jeff Lamb, who was a vice president of the World Bank, to corrupt the ANC, and particularly his former comrade and colleague at the University of Sussex, Thabo Mbeki, and that as a result, the ANC has swallowed various, almost as it were, entirely World Bank and neoliberal strategies for South Africa. A more serious thesis, as far as I'm concerned, is that the collapse of the Soviet Union, the discreditation of, quote, socialism, and the essential collapse of the viability of a social democratic project throughout the world have very seriously impacted on the ability of left-wing governments anywhere to effect a real change, particularly a party like the ANC, which always had in its mind that the Soviet comrades will deliver us the plan once we're in power and we will be able to change the world. Something else which is seldom spoken about but I think is important is that, and I can testify to this personally, that by 1990 the leadership and the older levels of the ANC were politically exhausted. We had been beaten, you know, bombed, tortured, killed, to the extent that for 20 years of really intense struggle in South Africa and in the region had sapped the will and the ability of the ANC and people in the broader resistance to continue to resist. And something else that has to be mentioned, it is not often said, is that in the very short period between 1990 and 1994, between F.W. de Klerk's speech on the 2nd of February, legalizing the ANC and other groups, and Nelson Mandela's assumption or inauguration in May 1994, of the 7 most important leaders in the ANC, 6 of them were either died or were marginalized politically. Governor Mbeki had essentially been put on the political sidelines and no longer had any influence over the main leadership of the ANC. Oliver Tambo suffered a catastrophic stroke in late 1989 and died in 1993, if I'm not mistaken. Chris Hani was assassinated. Joe Slovo was diagnosed with terminal cancer in the early 1990s, and he died very shortly after taking office. Walter Sisulu went into retirement, which left only Nelson Mandela, who was 76 when he became president and didn't want to assume the ranks, and Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki, who had always been groomed as the successor and essentially had played a fundamental role in the negotiation process. So we have a movement that has been exhausted by a long struggle and whose key leadership is no longer in place. That being said, let me look now at what I call the roots of Marikana. I think one of the striking things about South Africa's post-World War II history is that at fairly regular moments, almost every decade, the country has been shaken by an event or a decision which fundamentally calls into question an entire period of development, which seems somehow to crystallize the conflicts and issues of the previous period, and which highlights the political dilemmas confronting every shade of political opinion in the country, and the reaction to which determine the phase of development. I don't have time in the 15 minutes that are left to me to go into all of these. I just want to mention a few of them, and particularly to focus on the global, the regional, the national, and if possible, the local implications of each of them. The first of these was the August 1946 African mine workers' strike, which essentially transformed the ANC from a small, fairly elitist protest group into a mass nationalist movement. It laid down the model for what became the 1950s mass nonviolent resistance. It also led to the collapse of General Smuts's United Party government and the coming to power of the National Party in South Africa. And this was done just at the time when the Bretton Woods settlement was being put in place and the entire post-war welfare state model was being developed. 14 years later, or less than 14 years later, in a town known in a place called Sharpeville, the massacre of 69 and probably a lot more demonstrators protesting against the past laws signaled the end of the ANC's mass and non-violent resistance. Made it impossible for there to be legal mass protest, particularly since the ANC and other organizations were banned a few days later. This was always also the beginnings of the golden age of the Bretton Woods system. The 1960s were the period of the flowering of the age of mass consumption in the West, when it really seemed that the post-war settlement, the Bretton Woods settlement, had brought to an end a particular period of capitalist development and established a new model. In South Africa, the defeat of the resistance following Sharpeville and the catastrophic defeat, the virtual destruction of the defeat, forced the ANC into a very hasty decision to take up arms. The armed struggle decision, which was not widely discussed, it was a sort of fait accompli, decided by a very small group of people. And more particularly, it led the South African government into the more rapid application of what is known as Grand Apartheid, the whole Bantustan scheme. The period that followed, the decade or so that followed, has been called by myself and others the golden age of apartheid. Ironically, I hope you understand, it was the golden age in the sense that it led to mass consumption within the white population as a whole. Every white person in South Africa, living standards was dramatically changed in the 1960s. It was absolutely phenomenal, the rapidity of this change. It was the period in which there was apparently no real opposition to apartheid except towards the end of the period from the emerging Black consciousness movement. It was the period in which the regime was triumphalist, and it was possibly the bleakest period in South African history. This period was brought to an end in January 1973 with the strikes in Durban, the rolling strikes in Durban. And these are significant for a number of reasons which were not appreciated at the time. Some of the reasons were appreciated at the time, but I'm going to suggest to you that the most important significance of this reason was missed by almost everybody, myself included. We all, those of us who were involved in the struggle and in the analysis of South Africa, understood that the Durban strikes and more particularly the Soweto uprising 3 years later represented a watershed. They put an end to the so-called golden end of apartheid, the golden age of apartheid. The regime would henceforth, until 1994, be on the defensive. It would be unable to solve the contradictions of South African society and the particular conflicts that its own mode of governance imposed on South Africa. It also brought to an end, although this wasn't immediately apparent and only became so towards the end of the decade, of the guaranteed increase in white living standards. And why did it do so? Why did it do so? Because what most analysts missed at the time, was that 1990, the Durban strikes occurred some 17 months after an under-analyzed event in world history had occurred, but which fundamentally changed the trajectory of global capitalism. And that was the abandonment by the United States of the convertibility of the US dollar, which brought the Bretton Woods system effectively crashing down about our ears. It ended, we didn't realize it at the time, it ended the possibility of the welfare state, and it posed some very dramatic questions, which almost no group on the left managed to analyze, about how capitalism would develop and what that meant for left-wing opposition and an alternative project. It also, this beginning of this process was compounded a few months after the Durban strikes by the effects of the first oil shock following the Yom Kippur War, which dramatically, for South Africa, increased the price of South Africa's principal exports. It led very shortly to a short-lived rise in the gold price, but it made it in the long term impossible for the regime to sustain the economic model on which South Africa was built. It made it impossible for two reasons. Because global and South African capitalism were evolving away from the cheap labor model on which apartheid was built. Apartheid was essentially, and I'm simplifying massively, but it was an attempt to maintain a cheap migrant labor system in South Africa, which permitted very high degrees of profitability for industry and enabled the essentially import substitution model of South African industrialization to work. The decision of Nixon to abandon the convertibility of the dollar and the economic crisis that affected the whole of the West throughout the 1970s set in motion what we today call globalization, which fundamentally transformed the place of South Africa in the global economy. And it brought to the end, it really destroyed the possibility of extending an import substitution model. In South Africa at the time, the most enlightened and perspicacious strategists of business thought that the solution to this was to increase the local market for domestic manufactured goods. In other words, to recognize black trade unions, increase wages for black trade unions, and expand the market for industrial goods beyond the privileged white sector, to incorporate a privileged sector of blacks in this expanding market without undoing the political and social features of apartheid. So essentially this was what turned into, a few years later, P.W. Botha's reform program. And here I want to focus on the ANC. Because when the Durban strikes and even the Soweto uprising occurred, the ANC was woefully unprepared, organizationally and theoretically. The Communist Party equally so. The ANC and the Communist Party were still in the desert of exile. And despite the fetish made of the armed struggle, almost nothing had been done to strike at the structures of the South African state. Soweto enabled the ANC to reposition itself in terms of the influx of thousands and thousands of young black militants, most of whom had been schooled in black consciousness, who were determined to return to South Africa and strike back. It also increased the ANC's international credibility. It did not change the way in which either the South African Communist Party or the ANC understood the issue of South Africa. And this became strikingly clear as the post-Soweto struggle began to increase. From the period between the Soweto uprising to the state of emergency the first state of emergency in September, if I'm not mistaken, September 1985, almost no attempt was made within the ranks of the leadership of the ANC or the Communist Party to understand what Botha's reforms meant. We were told that it was just an attempt to camouflage apartheid, that this was just nonsense. And those of us who insisted that it did have some political significance, and that it particularly had an impact on the capacity of the ANC to mobilize a broad class alliance against apartheid, we were dismissed as ultra-leftists. Again, those of us in the ANC who insisted that globalization was changing the nature of global capitalism, undermining the existing models of socialism, and would have long-term consequences for an ANC government, were again essentially disciplined. I remember a very painful meeting after Rob Davies and I had put in a formal proposal to the ANC leadership to set up a program to analyze the transformations of South African capitalism. We were told that we were ultra-leftists, and if we didn't shut up, we'd be disciplined. So that as the global economy began to change, as regional war assumed catastrophic proportions, as local resistance exploded, the ANC, as some of the people in this room can testify, was still trapped in an earlier model. And particularly this focused around their analysis of the emergence of black trade unions, of the new democratic trade union movement. Terms like yellow trade unionism were thrown around. It took a very long time for the South African Communist Party to realize that something was going on inside the ranks of the South African working class. And if they continued to denounce this as mere yellow trade unionism or the impossibility of real trade unionism, they would miss the boat. And it was only by the mid-1980s that the Communist Party decided to begin to get into the question of organizing black unions and make its position felt. So if we take the period of the two emergencies of 1985 and 1986, and particularly the post-1986, or the 1986 and following extreme crackdown by Botha and the emergence of an essentially militarized state. This was happening, and I would argue at a number of levels, as I've said, global, national, etc. But neither the South African government nor the ANC fully understood the logic of what was occurring. Both the South African government, which was desperately trying to maintain, and by this I mean the National Party government, which was desperately trying to maintain models of ethnic privilege, and the ANC were essentially thinking about the new period with the intellectual framework of the past. And the big change of September 1990 was essentially the recognition on the part of F.W. de Klerk. The collapse of the Berlin Wall and the clear decline of the Soviet Union spelled the end of a period of South African history. F.W. de Klerk told von Zyl-Slabbert that he would have been mad not to have unbanned the ANC, because the National Party leadership in the Afrikaner Broederbond was profoundly convinced that the end of effective Soviet support for the ANC meant that the ANC would be isolated and unable to establish either a domestic political base or, more importantly, the financial base to conduct an electoral policy. So that by unbanning the ANC, the regime thought that it would weaken it. And it did and it didn't. And I want to end here. It did and it didn't. How did it do so? Or how did it not do so? It clearly did not take away the ANC's mass base. It clearly did not, as it thought that it would be able to do, destroy the aspiration for a democratic state, one person, one vote. But what it did manage to do, fundamentally, it managed to do two things. It managed to outmaneuver the ANC in the negotiation process to a very dramatic extent. And this was not only the government. The large-scale enterprises played a huge role in this. Around the details, the so-called technical details, most of the negotiations of which on the part of the ANC were undertaken by Thabo Mbeki and not revealed to the rest of the ANC leadership, very far-reaching concessions were made. Very far-reaching concessions were made around the principle as expressed by Dick Goss. I don't know if any of you remember who Dick Goss was. I don't know if he's still alive. At the time, he was the chairman of the South African breweries. Now SAB Miller, if I'm not mistaken, the world's greatest, largest beer-making company. Dick Goss said to a very close friend of mine, during this period of negotiations, I will agree to anything the ANC wants, as long as they allow me to take my capital out of the country. So around the technicalities of fiscal policy, monetary policy, investment policy, and particularly the issue of the controls on the movement of foreign exchange, not just the logic of globalization, was pushing South Africa in this direction. But the concessions made by the ANC, and particularly Thabo Mbeki, around issues of capital controls were fundamental to setting up the situation that we have now. They were fundamental because the ANC had long refused to study what would happen in the transition period. And I'm going to end here. The ANC refused to acknowledge that the decline of the Soviet Union, which was patent to everybody from 1985 onwards, the decline of the existing models of what we used to call actually existing socialism, now long disappeared socialism, that the collapse of those models, and particularly the rise of mass resistance within the Eastern countries, against Eastern Bloc countries, against those models, in fact left the ANC without an intellectual plan. And we have a movement, both in the Communist Party and in the ANC, and at the time, Thabo Mbeki was the chairman of the South African Communist Party, although he abandoned ship very rapidly. We have a movement which was intellectually and culturally incapable of thinking beyond the plan. Because the constant reply to any question about what are we going to do afterwards, when we come to power, after liberation, was always, the Soviet comrades know how to deal with this. They will send us the experts, and that's what will happen. Well, the Soviet comrades patently did not know how to deal with it. And other people had a plan. And I don't want to suggest for an instant that Thabo Mbeki personally sold out or became corrupt. Compared with Jacob Zuma, you know, he's pristine pure. And I never thought that I'd say this, but I regret that he's no longer president of South Africa because but he wasn't as bad as Zuma. But the plan was offered, and the cultural and intellectual disposition of the ANC led it down that path. And we have, and this is the last point that I want to make, this absurd situation, 1995 to 1996, when ostensibly the ANC was elected on the Reconstruction and Development program. Ostensibly, J. Naidu is the minister charged with effecting transformation, and Thabo Mbeki erects around himself a small number of people, some of whom studied in Canada, are well known to some of us, which put forward a pure neoliberal blueprint for South Africa. And when this was presented to the ANC caucus, and a number of very close friends remain members of that caucus had told me this, it was presented by Thabo Mbeki as non-negotiable. Any comrade who questions this will be redeployed. And successive meetings of the ANC caucus were treated to the surreal picture of Trevor Manuel, who was, at that stage, he was not yet Minister of Finance, but very shortly would be, reading out long sections of Das Kapital to justify what became the GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Reconstruction Program. And the fact that the ANC had turned down the proposals of the Van Zyl Commission, Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, for a mixed electoral system, constituencies and proportional representation, gave immense power to the ANC leadership. Anybody who dared question it would be, quote, redeployed. So there are other factors at work here. I don't want to suggest for an instant that this is why South Africa is in the impasse that it was. But I think that we need to, our analysis needs to focus at all of the levels that I have suggested. We need to understand that long-term dynamics of South African society are still at play. They are changing. But that the response of the political movement which managed to capture the support of vast numbers of South Africa has always been too slow, and its long-standing political culture has not permitted it to understand what is going on. So with that, I will just say one more thing. Since we marked in December the death of Nelson Mandela, I think it's important not just to stress his importance, but it's also his importance, his global significance. It's important to understand that Mandela made a series of catastrophic mistakes. between February 1990 and his swearing in May 1994. There were four, I would suggest. The first was to unilaterally decree the dissolution of the United Democratic Front. We can debate why this was done, and there was a certain logic underlying it, but that cut off the emerging popular democratic trend and organization at the knees. The second massive error was to accept the report of the Margot Commission on the eve of his inauguration. The Margot Commission had been appointed by F.W. de Klerk to inquire into the salaries of senior bureaucrats, ministers, and MPs after Apartheid, and the Commission recommended that these salaries be tied to those in the private sector. So suddenly somebody like Jacob Zuma, who had never earned a salary in his life as a member of the ANC, suddenly he was going to earn the equivalent of the CEO of a major South African enterprise. We can talk about the effects of that as well. This was not discussed in the ANC, and there were options. One of them was a leadership code along the lines of Tanzania. The third mistake, but that probably the most important, was to choose Thabo Mbeki as his vice president. He had an alternative, although that alternative has turned out possibly even worse. And the final mistake was not to, as he has himself acknowledged, not to have raised the question of AIDS when it was immediately obvious, long before 1990, that South Africa was going to be savaged by an AIDS crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed. And I'd like now to turn to Hein's talk on arrested development, South Africa after apartheid and critical refugees.
You guys want to go on the side?
You want me to go on the side?
Yeah,
Yeah, we've got to.
Oh yeah,
Oh, Blair's doing that. I miss hearing you talk.
Yeah, me too.
I understand your decision, but I miss